This is the DLR Cast, the essential podcast for fans of Diamond David Lee Roth. All right, welcome to the DLR Cast, where two fans, not fanboys, talk all things David Lee Roth and Van Halen and other things as well. I am Steve, joined as always with my good friend Darren Paltrowitz. What's happening, Darren?
Great day, right? Great day, Steve.
Yeah, well, it's a great episode. I am really psyched for this week's guest, one Greg Renoff, author of two fantastic books, Van Halen Rising, which tells the story of, Van Halen's rise to prominence in Southern California, as well as just released in April, Ted Templeman, a platinum producer's life in music.
Yeah, you just said a lot of words right there, and every one of those words was true. It's not just a different kind of truth.
I see what you did there. Well,
Yeah.
You know what? A little ain't enough when it comes to Greg Renoff. And no, this was quite the enjoyable conversation. If you're listening to this and you're a Dave fan, you probably, I would bet you read, and you're a Van Halen fan, you read Van Halen Rising. I mean, it's an incredible book. I give it 2 thumbs up, 5 stars. It is so well researched, and we get into it. He talks about the book. We get into, how Van Halen really blew up in Southern California and how they did it. So much research and so much info on these infamous backyard parties, and man, it was just a delight talking to him.
Yeah, to say the very least. I think that this is a different kind of guest that we've had before. You know, we've had some people who've worked with Dave in different capacities. We've had some musicians who are fans of Dave, but nobody who spent years researching Dave and speaking to maybe hundreds of people who knew or worked with Dave in some capacity.
Yeah, that's what really blew my mind and we talked about, just so much about Van Halen and Dave, but also the band's evolution in such a short amount of time. And, one thing kind of struck me, and I won't give away all the interview, but we were talking, as you'll hear in the interview, when we were talking about these infamous backyard parties where these weren't just a bunch of kids in a garage. These were
Right.
2,000 people in a mammoth backyard in Pasadena. And it struck me because he was talking about flyering and all that. I mean, you have to remember, this is like 1973, 74. This is before social media, and they did their own social media. They would print out thousands of flyers, get them over every school, under every windshield wiper, at concerts everywhere. And I mean, they, nobody did. I can't think of a band that ever came up that way, the way they did, stepping into, before they reached, getting to the club level by building an audience doing these kind of backyard parties. It's an amazing story, and Greg just tells it so well in the book. And like you mentioned, talk to everybody, and we got so many great details from him, as well as a few spoilers for that book, as well as hearing him talk about his book with Ted Templeman, his book on Ted Templeman.
Yeah, when we think about the bands who flyered, we think about Motley Crue and we think of Poison. And Motley Crue, that was early 80s, and Poison,
Sure.
That was the mid 80s that they were flyering. So we're talking about maybe the first hard rock band that really made it off of street promotion and DIY style flyering and all that. Like, the Beatles were not flyering.
No.
I mean, what other band can we think of that was really flyering before Van Halen? Nothing's coming to mind to me.
I'm glad you mentioned. I mean, maybe there was some, small bands, other places that did that, and certainly I bet there was fans back then who took it upon themselves maybe to make zines and flyers and things like that. But as far as handling their own promotion, their own self-promotion, pre-management, doing it all on their own, booking, and sure, lots of bands do this, but they did it so damn well, and there was a lot of things they did first, really. I mean, like you mentioned.
Yeah, to say the least. And by the way, when you said that there were mammoth backyard parties before, was that a pun?
It should have been. I caught that. I was waiting for you to. I thought I teed that up for you really easily there. Mammoth being the name of. Do I have this right? Eddie and Alex's band before Dave joined the band.
Yeah, you did do that correct. And without spoiling too much, we spoke about the original bassist of Van Halen, Mark Stone. We spoke about Dave's dad. I don't think we've talked about Dave's dad in a podcast before, have we?
No, we have not, and and we don't give the spoilers away, but boy, did we learn a lot about Dave's dad and some appearances and different things he did. That was mind blowing.
Yeah, it's our longest episode yet the most educational. I learned a lot. We could do a part 2, a part 3, and a part 4 with Greg, and still maybe not tap on everything.
Well, I'm a fan. I mean, if it's music and hard rock related and he writes it, I will check it out. And I am still awaiting my Ted Templeman book to arrive. The mail has been a little bit slow here of late, but
yeah.
He really gave some great insight into Ted. We learned some different Van Halen stories there. And we talked about this in the interview too. I mean, I would bet most hard rock fans know Ted, and it kind of makes sense because it was his biggest records, but know Ted through Van Halen. But man, did he have a huge pedigree and a huge resume before Van Halen. So it was really cool to talk about that and learn a lot about that.
For sure. I don't think we talked Van Hagar in this interview, did we?
I don't think we did too much. Well, you know what? He does bring up the fact that I think they wanted the guys wanted they wanted Ted to do 5150, right?
You're right. We did talk about that, but this also might be our first interview where I didn't ask the person, Dave or Sammy. I don't think I did in this one.
I don't think you did either. So, but
either way, man, Greg, wow, such a thrill.
Well, on that note, here's that interview. Thanks for listening, and thanks for downloading the DLR cast. Tell your friends, rate us, review us, give us 4 out of 5 stars. We're humble, and thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, as promised, this week's interview is a great one, and one we're looking forward to having a conversation here with Greg Renoff, the author of Van Halen Rising, How a Southern California Backyard Party Band Saved Heavy Metal, and the brand new Ted Templeman, a platinum producer's life in music. How you doing, Greg?
Great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing this, man. We set up in our intro, Darren and I are fans, but we're not fanboys, and so we, we will slice to ribbons all sorts of different things regarding Dave. And this is the DLR cast, and I want to get into a bunch of things from Van Halen Rising, and as well as Ted Templeman, sure. and I certainly want to find out what may be next for you, because I actually have a book idea. I'll pitch your way. So
bring it on. I'm ready. I'm all
your investigatory talents, I think, will might do it well. So, but anyway, so let's talk about first off, I guess, with Van Halen Rising, because hopefully, I think if people are listening to this, they know what this book is about. It's really the most in-depth book I've read as far as how Van Halen got to, at least as far as how they got to where they got to be for the first album, and what the stuff you uncovered was mind-blowing. I mean, first off, what was the genesis to get to do this book, to do Van Halen Rising? I mean, where did the idea start? And it's a hell of a piece of investigatory journalism, what you uncovered in Southern California there.
Well, for me, growing up a fan, I've talked about this a lot. It was Van Halen was kind of it for me in the 80s. That was the band. I was my number one band. And life goes on, and you go off and do different things with life. Some people become doctors, some people become lawyers. I became a historian, and that was always my first love, was history. And I went to grad school and I got a PhD in history. And kind of midpoint of my academic career, I'd gotten tenure, and I had a little bit of time one summer where I sort of had a little breathing room, and I didn't have to think about, I got to write the next journal article and kind of do something academic. I was going to do a fun little what I thought was going to be like a little even article for like Van Halen News Desk. I didn't really have any big plans for it. I was just going to do a little thing on Van Halen's beginnings, because I had started to read a little bit about their origins. The Inside Magazine, you guys probably have seen that special issue that was like, what's got to be 20 years old now, 23 years old, that talked about the club days, and some of that stuff really kind of got stuck in my craw. I was like, this is really interesting, and this is all new to me, and I think was new to a lot of people who read that stuff. And you go to Wikipedia, and there was all this, I don't want to say misinformation, but there was just a lot of like gaps and things that didn't make sense in terms of the band's beginnings, because people were just sort of editing Wikipedia, be like, I read this in an interview and I think this fits
right
here. So right, and so and that's how it kind of started for me. I did a couple of interviews with some locals in Pasadena, and these guys at the end of the interview would say, hey, you should talk to this guy, and it just started that way. So I just became increasingly aware of the fact that I didn't think anyone else was going to do a book like this, and I just thought, if you wanted to know about how Van Halen got started, how they formed, the whole Mark Stone issue, the Gene Simmons stuff, which was really interesting to me, I was going to have to do it. And I don't mean to say I'm the only one who could have done it. Obviously, there are people who could have done it, but it's a matter of having the interest and the desire and the drive to do it, because it took 230 interviews by the time I was done with the book. And I don't say that to sort of pat myself in the back. I just mean, it was not an easy thing to research. It's not something you could just kind of go to newspapers or just go, I'll just read some old circus magazines and I'll put this whole thing together. It wasn't like that. So, I knew I had the ability, and I just, it was one of these things that, part of me was like, do I want to do it? Because it's, it didn't really fit with what I was doing in terms of my professional career, which was, rock bio isn't exactly like mainstream history stuff. When you go look, college campus, people aren't usually doing that. But, for me, it just became a thing I really decided that I wanted to do and felt compelled to do it. And I just became more and more interested. I mean, more I heard, I was like, this, as the book, I hope, demonstrates to people, it isn't if the subject matter is boring. It's like the more you learn, the more you're like, shit, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this. And I just kept going and going. And, for me, the other thing I would say along those lines is that, as I talked about a few times when the book was first released, I really didn't feel as if, and I still don't really feel as if, that Van Halen gets their full due among the great classic rock bands. I mean, everyone knows Zeppelin, The Who, The Beatles, kind of go down the line and sort of all this sort of, bowing down to these acts, rightfully so, for their influence. And I felt, especially in that period of the 2000s, where the band was kind of adrift and there really wasn't any sense that anything was really going to happen from, whatever, like 99 to 2007-ish, right, where it just sort of seemed like the whole thing was kind of a mess. I kind of look back on that period too, and obviously I was writing the book after that period, but I kind of felt like, one of the reasons why Van Halen maybe doesn't get their due is because they were just so scattered, and it was just such a,
right.
There was no it is like the whole thing kind of came apart in so many ways. Like Zeppelin never did that. The Who never did that. I mean, The Who, obviously, you lose Keith Moon, they get Kenny Jones and whatever. Then they sort of, but it always seemed to remain sort of The Who, and you kind of, even if it's Entwistle's gone, it's still the two guys, and it sort of continued marching along. The Stones, you always had Mick and Keith kind of marching along. We had all this stuff that was going on with the band, and I felt that was part of the reason why, people were kind of like, oh, whatever, Van Halen doesn't really matter, or whatever. Like, I think that still may be the case for a lot of people, but I think that was definitely in much more in this century was a much more a thing to be like, kind of like Van Halen doesn't really matter the way we knew growing up how much they mattered.
Right. Exactly. It's interesting you mentioned those other bands, because even with periods of inactivity or people dying or people breaking or whatever it might be, you had a label and management that kind of kept the flame alive, via reissue campaigns, great box sets, the occasional reunion tour. But you're right, there was a dead zone period where there was, save for that Misbegotten Sammy tour in 2004. Right. I mean, between Van Halen 3 and when they got, reunited in 2007, I mean, we talk about this every now and then. I want to get back to the origins of Van Halen at the beginning of the book, but
sure.
One thing that always strikes me with Van Halen is just, throughout their career is just when you look at what's going on, 2 decades worth of virtually so little activity. It's just the amount of time, for whatever reason. I'm not here to spread rumors of different things, whatever, but a lot of people know what the rumors are. But just the lost opportunities, man. You know what I mean? That a band that was so great that I think you're right. I don't think they necessarily get their due. Certainly Eddie does and always will, and the guitar magazines have sold millions of copies because of just the yet another tablature analysis of Eruption or whatever. But you're absolutely right on that. But and Darren, jump in anytime here, because I got a bunch of things running through my brain. But I want to get to the book Van Halen Rising, because there was a bunch of things that really jumped out at me. The first off is that they're the only band I could think of that bands do the club circuit. They get out there. But Van Halen's the only band that actually blew up and started their legend doing a backyard party circuit, and the info and the details and how you found these people who,
Right.
The guy who who punched the woman who punched the kid, who tripped over the hose that got water flowing out of the pool pump and damn near electrocuted the band. It fucking blew me away, the details. But what really just really blew me away also was the fact that I can't think of a band that really came up and really blew up that way before ever hitting the clubs. I mean, it wasn't just legend. There was a whole circuit. These guys made money, and it wasn't a bunch of guys milling around in a garage playing for kids, with a couple cases of beer. We're talking hundreds of people would show up at these things.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys saying that about the book. I mean, I think for me, that was part of the thing. Was like, you can find these people too. They're still on, look up the names. They're still on Facebook. You can message them themselves. They'll tell you the same stuff. I mean, that was the thing. It was like, but for them, it was like the central social thing of their childhood. You know what I mean? Like for a lot of these people, it was Van Halen was our band. Mammoth was our band. This was our thing. For some kids, obviously, it's like you win the national, win the state championship in football. You're in New Jersey. It's a big deal. You win. That's like their thing that they all kind of bond together and remember. And for these kids who like rock music, who grew up in Pasadena, these parties were, it was like, no one ever forgot them. And I always talk about two people are like, how do you know people were telling the truth? I said, well, we talked to 40, 50 people, and they're basically telling you the same thing, kind of fleshing it out. I mean, obviously, could be exaggerations. I mean, we get that, right? It's like, it's 50 years ago, people's memories are what they are. But like, you sort of like, you're like, this is what happens. And then you like, as a historian, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna look in the newspaper, and you scroll through the Pasadena Star News, and you're like, see these little articles that say police break up, backyard, riot or whatever. And it doesn't mention Van Halen because the band doesn't matter, but they're like, 600 kids were in the backyard and there was bottles and rocks around. You're like, holy shit, they're telling the truth. That's basically what happened. That's what they're telling the truth. That's it. And I never had any particular doubt that people were quote unquote lying. But you know what I mean? Like, it's like when you see that
right.
verification of like, it was like, it made the newspaper as an unsigned band. Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean about it being something that you would read these details and you just felt more and more like I wanted to get as much of the full story as I could.
Yeah, something that really struck me, his name has already come up once, Mark Stone.
Yeah.
He's kind of in the unfortunate footnote section of everything, right. Along with
right.
Pete Best. And
right.
if you're really, really a big rock fan, you'll know who Jason Evermore is, the only guy to be displaced out of both Nirvana and Soundgarden. Right. I think there's a guy who was also kicked out of both NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, Charlie something or other. Like, these guys are out there. And Mark Stone has that unfortunate footnote of, yeah, he was the guy that was in Van Halen. But I think you're one of the first people to really give him his due as existing and being a part of what built Van Halen.
It was interesting. I think Mark never said this to me directly, but I definitely think that Mark was apprehensive when he kind of heard I was writing this book. Again, because of this, he never said this, the stigma of that or whatever. Again, the book wasn't going to be focused on Mark Stone, but I was going to talk about him. And when the book came out and he read it, he actually came up to me and thanked me. And I'm not saying that to give myself credit, but I think he really felt like, because he deserved it. He was with those guys for 3 years, as I say in the book. I mean, not going to be hanging around Ed and Al if you can't play for 3 years. They're going to be rid of you, and like, we know how it is with the brothers and how they are. They're not going to put up with that. You'd be gone in 3 hours. You'd be like, you're gone, you're fired. And so Mark was the guy who brought the first Black Sabbath album to Eddie and Alex and showed it to him, and was the guy who learned those songs with those guys, all those crazy prog rock stuff they did when they were early on, kind of like obsessing over these records. And I always had you got to have great sympathy for someone like that. And I don't know if you even feel sorry for the guy, but I mean, anyone can imagine what it would be like to be like, oh, I was, whatever. I was cut the year before the team won the Super Bowl or something like that. And that was my entire life's dream. And like, I get cut from the team. They go on to win the Super Bowl. I don't get a Super Bowl ring. I don't get to play. And it never happens for me. And it doesn't mean you didn't work hard in practice and do all the things that you would expect a great player to do. You just never had that chance to be on that stage. And so, yeah, I mean, Mark is Mark is a guy who deserves. He designed that logo. I mean, everyone as soon as you have those, those quote unquote, the Mark Stone logo shirts, people love those. They're like, oh, Mark, I want that logo because it's the early Van Halen stuff. I mean, Mark was, and again, there's obviously, like you mentioned, a lot of bands where a lot of guys kind of departed. I don't know, how many of those guys were in the band from, roughly like 1970 to 74. Mark was, something like that. I never quite could exactly pinpoint that actually, but 71 to basically 74. He was with those guys for like 3+ years. It's a long time to be, moving gear with those guys, getting gigs, doing the whole thing. And so, and I think he was an important part of the, part of that whole rise out of Pasadena, where he sort of, laid down that first foundation for those guys. They went on, they got Mike, as we know, for a number of reasons, probably no breaking news is his voice, and he was a very talented guy and kind of was the right guy to fit in there for Van Halen. But I mean, it was fun. It was fun to talk to Mark, and like I said, that really made me feel good personally. And I didn't know how he was going to react, but I meant it to be respectful of him and saying, look, you really, you were there and you did stuff that deserves, of someone to go, hey, thanks for, helping those, whatever you did to help those guys along the way. It's cool.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to think too, again, you bring up that football analogy. It's like, I mean, who's to say if they would have got that far had Mark stayed in the band? I mean, there's something to be said about this incredible chemistry that they had. And, but you're right. I mean, as far as the way the Van Halen brothers were and all that, I mean, you do have to have a little sympathy you absolutely have to have some sympathy for the guy. I mean, when you're that, you just can't help but wonder and play the what if game.
Yeah. And it just keeps going. Like, I'm looking at you, Steve, right now, and I see that Blink-182 plaque you have behind you. And that's a band where they had a drummer who was on the first 2 records, and then he was gone. And everyone thinks, hey, Travis Barker's the drummer of Blink-182. And you got to think, well, who's the guy that hauled all that gear for 2 years, who was along for the record deal? So when you think about it, probably every band that we could talk about, U2, didn't they have the Edge's brother on second guitar for the first few years?
You guys are blowing my mind with the trivia there. I don't know that. That's interesting.
There's a book idea right there for you. The what ifs. The guys who came so close to. I mean, the Pete Best, right? But it's littered with dozens of people like that. I mean, not to even go further down the rabbit hole, but I'm naturally wearing a Cheap Trick shirt because I adore those guys. Well, there was a singer before Robin Zander, for goodness sakes.
Randy Hogan, right?
It was Zeno, yeah. So
Randy Zeno,
but
yeah.
We're going off the rails here. It's Darren and I often do. So bringing around to those early years again, a couple things that really stood out, and just a lot of things I knew as being a deep fan. And I've always believed this, and these were certainly arguments that I had in the old Sammy versus Dave days. I graduated high school in '85. I mean, right. The thrill of being a high school graduate and all that was in front of me, to coupled with the sheer depression that what the hell is Dave going to do without Van Halen? I mean,
you graduated and they broke up basically. It's like right same summer.
That was basically it. And then the arguments and the fights over, Eat 'em and Smile versus 5150. Well, I would tell anybody that listened back then, for what I knew from reading Kerrang! Magazine and everything else, was that, this Van Halen got to where they were and are so much so because of Dave. And your book really, one of the overarching things I got out of this is that without Dave, Van Halen could have been a power trio playing prog rock for 10 more years easily.
I really believe that. I mean, again, if you think about how the brothers kind of see, even today, the world of promotion, the world of how do we market the band?
Right.
We're I think we all kind of know that Roth is probably as not as powerful of a voice as he was in 1983 in the band. For whatever reason, we'll just leave that to speculation, but that there's definitely a different dynamic in terms of how the band operates today than there was 30 years ago. And I mean, that's just the kind of the way I think Eddie and Alex kind of see things. They're not naturally guys who are going to go out and seek the spotlight. They're not going to seek to promote. And I honestly think that comes from an area of almost, I don't want to say humbleness, but sort of this, if we're good, people will know we're good. We don't need to tell anybody. We don't need to. I think that's kind of comes from their old world. I mean, that could be complete. Wolfgang pops on the chat here and he's like, "That's bullshit. Whatever. You don't know what you're talking about." I don't know, like the voice of reason pops up, like, "You don't really know what you're talking about." That's just my speculation. Someone who's closer with those guys would know. I don't have any insight into that. But it's interesting. I think that they don't see it as almost as, dirty, kind of like, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they're sort of like, it's like what. That's sort of the whole marketing. I don't think they like it. I think they did it when they had to. Obviously, it was saying, you do it, you do the interviews, you do the press conferences, whatever, you do the sit downs. Right. But I don't think they ever were like, yes, I really want to do this. I think,
Yeah, and certainly in the embryonic years, I don't think they necessarily knew how to do it either. Right. I mean, Dave's given him wardrobe details and stuff, but also from a musical end of things, they wouldn't have been doing Earth, Wind, and Fire covers and Casey and Sunshine Band, all that stuff, which Dave brought an element of soul to that band, which heretofore did not exist. And regardless of, how much, and that's a whole other conversation, I'm sure, but how much of that songwriting process there was. I mean, Dave brought melodies, as we know. He brought certainly the lyrics, but Jamie's Crying would not be what it is without Dave in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when I think about what Roth did for the group, I mean, I think he'd always talked. That's the thing. He had talked about it when he had made, in his book. He talked about I checked the songs for danceability. It was my not surprised to learn that was actually pretty damn accurate when you talk to people and they talked. I talked to Pasadena locals who would talk about how much they hated it when Dave joined because it changed the sound of the group. They would they didn't like Dave, whatever. I mean, that's all matter of taste, but they didn't like it because it was like they were doing less Black Sabbath covers and they were doing more pop stuff because Roth was like, look, guys, congratulations, we can play Backyard Parties till whenever. But Roth was driven. I mean, that was a thing too that I'm sure you guys picked up on, was that the Red Ball Jet stuff, and I pretty quickly figured out that a lot of the stuff Dave tested out in Red Ball Jet or tried to do in Red Ball Jet, was like a preview for later, like going down to the Sunset Strip with this basically high school group that was not ready to perform on the Sunset Strip, but, getting his dad to pay for a Motown choreographer. And these are the guys in Red Ball Jet that told me this. This is like the other guys in the band were like, yeah, this was Dave's dad's idea to get this choreographer to get us to have moves so we would be like able to make it onto this strip. And of course, it's laughable, right? But then you fast forward and you think, he got it. He understood that was the way to get a record deal. That was the way. You're not going to get a record deal playing in some subdivision in Arcadia. You're just not. You're going to have to play clubs, and you're going to have an act and something that people don't want to come see, not just sort of four guys. They just had the brothers had a different vision for it. I mean, they really wanted to be imagined like Black Sabbath. They thought we're just going to stand there, our hair hanging down, bashing away. And Dave was kind of like, there already is a Black Sabbath.
Right. Conversely, I think it has to be said too, we wouldn't be doing a DLR cast if Dave didn't hook up with Eddie Van Halen, which brings up one of the things that really blew my mind that I did not know about, is that, and this comes to Vision and Drive, he somehow identified Eddie's talent so early to the point where he tries out for the band, doesn't make it. Right. You fast forward a couple of years, he still really wasn't good enough to get into the studio, but drove, to sing on that. From what I gathered, he was taking singing lessons and trying to improve his voice up to, the first album practically. Yeah. But when I look at it, that drive and that vision, he tries out, he doesn't make it. And if you're in SoCal at that time, you've got, I would guarantee, I'm sure Terry Kilgore, George Lynch was a contemporary, probably 5 or 6 other hotshots that nobody remembers that was slinging a guitar in SoCal there. Right. Yep. And yet he was so zeroed in on Eddie.
He knew.
That really blows my mind. I mean,
I think that's the really interesting thing is like one of the guys in Red Ball Jet said to me, Dave was frustrated because he knew even including himself, he knew we didn't have it. Like what he saw where he wanted to be, we weren't even close to be. And he certainly knew that we weren't musically good enough, the guys. And yet, he knew too, he wasn't good enough, but he believed he could do it. You know what I mean? That type of thing. And so when he saw the brothers, he's like, well, here we go, And he saw the flaw what he saw the flaw in what they had. They didn't see it as a flaw, and in a lot of ways it wasn't. They could play the whole second side of Live at Leeds perfectly. There's not a flaw there, right? That's not a flaw. But he saw what the eventual end would be, which is you're going to go, no, you can't get a record deal doing that,
right?
And from Dave's standpoint, you wouldn't. Again, yeah, I mean, in theory, they're a heavy metal band. They could have gotten a record deal, but he meant like it probably wasn't going to happen where they're suddenly going to get discovered, playing in some garage party. That's what, and so he had his own, hey, let's make this into a different sort of sound and thing. He brought his musicality to the table and changed it. I mean, that's the most amusing thing to me too, is that, and it's not really amusing, it's just more interesting, is that Roth talks about how he tried to sing the stuff that the brothers liked, like the heavy metal Grand Funk stuff and all that. He's like, he talked about the first party they played at. He's like, we were terrible. It was so bad. He was like, I was so bad, because he kind of knew that wasn't his. He liked Led Zeppelin and stuff, but it wasn't his thing. Like to do that sort of, he had much more of a, like that pop Motown approach to songs. That's what he sang. If he was going to sing anything, that was what he was going to sing and pull it off. He wasn't going to be able to pull off, Speed King by Deep Purple effectively. Just, it wasn't his thing.
Well, it's two completely disparate record collections when you're thinking of it coming up. Sure, they probably both, everybody got into the Beatles, but but Dave's digging George Gershwin and James Brown and this big band stuff, while Eddie and Alex are doing bong hits, and there's nothing wrong with this, digging Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and everything else. And it's the perfect blend together when you think of. I mean, it really, and no other band really brought forth to this day, I don't think, that kind of chemistry, together like that. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think too, it's interesting to think about too, if they hadn't been in LA, I actually never really even thought about this, but part of the reason why they were able to make it is because they were in LA. But on the other hand, I don't know nationally sort of what the nightclub scene were in other places. Obviously, they were in Miami. There might have been a different nightclub scene, or New York City might have been a different nightclub scene. They may have had a different sound. But certainly Roth saw there were dozens and dozens and dozens of nightclubs where you played top 40. And I'm going to guess that was pretty much a universal thing in the United States at the time. I don't know for 100%, but that was obviously, there were clubs like that all over the country, where the idea was that you just came and you needed to play the top 40 hits. Right. No one really cared about your own song. No one cared about your songs. If you want to get paid and you want to get seen and on this stage, you better be able to play Elton John, Steely Dan, whatever, down the line, you Motown, whatever, like we talk about, all the hits that people want to hear. Right.
And two or three 40-minute sets a night too. So you had to be pretty deep.
more than that, 5 45-minute sets. That's how many they did, and they start to sneak in their originals and stuff like that. But like there's that great discussion in there about the kind of the first club they played. I think it was called Posh, I think it was, and they just, they didn't have enough material. They lied, and then they had to start playing Black Sabbath, and the owner basically cut the power. The owner cut the power. He was like, you guys get out of here. Don't ever come back. Because no one wants to hear this shit. I mean, my clients, my clientele doesn't want to hear this stuff. Get out of here, Go do that in your own basement.
Right on.
Yeah, so what I want to know of all this is if anyone in the Roth camp actually gave you feedback on any of the books, because we hear great stories about how Zero. Okay.
Or Van Halen's camp.
Nothing. No, I shouldn't say that. The only thing I've heard that is actually, I think, a legitimate anecdote is that I heard a guy sent me a picture of his copy of Halen Rising, and Michael Anthony had signed it. And some guy saw Michael Anthony had the book with him, and Mike signed it, and Mike's like, "Oh, it's a good book, good book." Wrote good book, Chris, in good reading or something like that, and was apparently said I like the or good book or something. I don't even nobody. I mean, people ask me that all the time. I have no idea. I have no idea. Obviously they're aware of it because it's like a book is written about your band. You're aware of it. I don't care. I don't care if it's good or bad. People know when someone writes a book about you. But I have never gotten any feedback from anybody. It's which is fine. It's just, it's always like people are always kind of surprised by it. I mean, you guys, people are always like, really? I'm like really? Really,
well, if you wrote a book about Kiss, I'm sure you would have heard from Bruce Kulick, Gene Simmons, and somebody from Eric Carr's camp within like a week of it coming out.
Probably. Look, I don't, I don't want to speculate
in those circles.
I don't want to speculate. I mean, and I don't, this, I could also kind of imagine the flip side of that. And they think like, you got to be a bit of a weirdo to write a book about me. Like anyone who's like obsessed enough to write a book, it's got to be really weird. We don't want to talk to this guy. I mean, again, I have no idea, and I don't ever expect that. I mean, I've talked about before that I pitched interview requests at the very end of the process of writing Van Halen Rising to Eddie. Got a very polite reply back, no, from Janie, his wife. I pitched it to Roth, and about 2 weeks after I sent it to Roth, I actually wrote back and was like, I'm thinking, well, maybe he's thinking about it. And I think just, whatever his manager had forgotten or whatever, and it just hadn't, kind of crossed Dave's transom. And he was like, nah, Dave's not going to do it either, which is fine. So that was it. I mean, that was the end of the deal. Of course, I talked to Mike. I mean, obviously I talked to Mike for the book. But, again, in terms of like the finished product, that's all I know is that Mike saw a copy of the book, apparently signed, I know he signed the book and wrote good. I saw the picture, like good read or good book, so at least Mike liked it, I guess, or thought it was worthwhile. So.
Mikey likes it.
Exactly. So there you go. That's my endorsement right there from Mike. And Ted liked it. And Ted Templeman liked it, right? There you go.
Well, that's a perfect segue to your brand new book. Just came out in April, Ted Templeman, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. I realized when I saw it come out that I was reminded of the fact that it had only been about 6 or 7 years before I actually found out and saw what Ted Templeman looked like. He was always faceless to me, him and Mutt Lange for years, I mean, everybody knows what George Martin looks like, right. And so even some other guys, but Ted, I have no idea. And he's on the cover there. So of course, Ted produced the first Van Halen record. As a huge fan, I know, so much that he produced, but I did not know that he produced, I knew he produced the Doobie Brothers and was, forgot the fact that he was involved with, was it Linda Ronstadt and Nicolette Larson? I mean, tell us about how, was Van Halen Rising, did that influence the next book? And I'm going to write about Ted.
Yeah, big time, because I was able to find a way to contact Ted. It was not easy to contact. Ted was just sort of had stepped away from the music industry in a lot of ways. I mean, he was doing stuff, whatever, consulting and stuff, but he was not like out there making records anymore, anything like that, pretty much. And I got a hold of him and interviewed him. And he seemed really eager to talk about Van Halen. He was like, you could tell it was like a big landmark experience in his life. The first Van Halen record, particularly, it was like, one of these things that's like, that's the iconic recordings he made. He made a lot of them. That was like one of the big landmarks was, What a Fool Believes, the Doobies, the first Van Halen record. He kind of go through. There was 5 or 6 of them, and that was one of the big ones. And so he was very eager to talk about it, and he liked the book. And so after the book came out, I basically pitched him the idea of Van Halen Rising. I said, hey, I want to do a book on you, and he was kind of like, "Are you serious?" Like, he really was like, he's like, who's going to want to read a book about me? And I was like, well, and I kind of had to, I talked him into it. I mean, I don't want to say he was like strongly against it, but he certainly was like, kind of like, nah, I mean, I don't know. And like, I don't think so. And, I had to keep talking to him about it to encourage him to do it. And then, as I've said before, I honestly think like when he was finally like, okay, I'll go ahead, good start and see what you do, whatever. There was no book contract or anything. It was just basically like, if you want to call a couple people or whatever to read some articles, whatever, do whatever you want to do. I honestly think he thought I would get like bored after 2 weeks. Like, well, there's that Van Halen, there's Doobies, whatever. It's just kind of boring to me, and I'll move on to something else. But I just kept going, and when we really got it going on the book, to kind of learn about Ted's childhood and how he was a jazz phenom himself, kind of like. Eddie in his own little world, like he was a trumpet phenom, a kid, like the 11-year-old kid you play with who plays with the adults, who plays trumpet with the 25-year-old piano player and the 25-year-old drummer. He was the little amazing little trumpet player in town in Santa Cruz. And then, the fact that he had been a pop star and had been on TV and had toured the country and I
never knew.
That stuff really, so that for me, that was always kind of in the mix. As I learned more about Ted, I thought, this, it isn't just a guy who made records, who had this really interesting musical life where he was a jazz guy, fell in love with the Beatles, formed a group. They had hits. They toured. They were on TV. He performed with Raquel Welch, Bob Hope, all these big stars on, on all these shows. And then, ended up pivoting into becoming a record producer, which was a whole interesting. And then had all these unusual, I say unusual, and kind of an unusual repertoire of like a wide, rather than being like the hard rock guy or some guys are like the blues guys or the, the jazz guys or whatever. He sort of did a whole bunch of different genres. And I thought that was all really interesting. So yeah, it definitely came out of Van Halen Rising. It was getting to know him, and then after the book coming out, him going, he wrote to me and goes, this is great. I loved it. And I was like, oh, okay. If you loved it, wow. you'll like a book about yourself. So, it was an honor, and he's a great guy. And I really think it was one of the great experiences of my life to do that with him, because I loved all those records I did. And I really, to be able to sit with him and talk to him about the way records are made, and basically have to learn to understand what a record producer does. And I tried my best to convey that in the book. That was the coolest part. It's like, actually, I thought I knew what a record producer did, but it turns out I knew like a tiny little sliver of what a record producer does, which really is, not at all like the full picture. But he kind of opened my eyes to all that stuff.
Yeah. In Ted's case, I mean, he was even more than a producer back then, because he was also a Warner Brothers executive, correct? Right. So I mean, he had a huge hand in championing, bands like Van Halen, and he didn't just turn in the master tapes and the label ran with it. No. I mean, he was an integral part of these people's careers. Yeah,
he got them signed, and then that was the other thing too. It was interesting when we talked about Van Halen. He really explained to me kind of what went on behind the scenes with these meetings. He's like, "You have any idea what what?" I'm like, "No." And he would say it to me like, "Do you have any idea?" And I'm like, "No." I was always like, "No." Like, I don't know anything. Really, tell me. And I mean, just basically the A&R process of picking everything from picking songs to basically helping push marketing money. As again, it wasn't only up to him, but basically going, "Hey, this is the song. This song, like, if Ted would say, I think this song is going to do well." That would mean something for that band. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about that dual role too, which obviously I think, as everybody knows, caused some consternation for Van Halen as well when it came down to 1984, because it was sort of like the record company and Ted wanted the record finished, and Eddie and Don and the band was kind of like dragging their feet, and there was this definite where they were much more working kind of more on the same team for a long time. There was much more of that push, whereas if Ted was an indie producer like a Mutt Lange, he'd be like, "Hey man, he would be kind of caught between the band and the record company, or Mutt Lange. You don't work for Epic, you don't work for a record company, or an indie producer." But Ted was a Warner Brothers executive vice president, so he was definitely, definitely had that thing there going on with the record company.
And without doing a spoiler here, I think your book is where I learned about the role that Ted played in the creative development of the song "I'll Wait." Oh, yeah. And crossing over two of his top artists that he ever produced ever. So thank you for that nugget. I mean, I think a lot of the releases that had the song "I'll Wait" on that don't have the full writing credits on there, if I'm correct.
That didn't come about till about 2000, at least on the printed, the releases. So that was I don't have. I mean, if you guys don't mind me spoiling it, I'll spoil the story. I mean, I think that the thing is that that was I think that caused Ted a lot of headaches and a lot of personal angst, because when Van Halen was trying to finish 1984, there was a song idea that became "I'll Wait." So what I mean by a song idea is there was a basic chord progression, and there were parts, but there was no melody and there was no lyrics. So it was, it was something you listen to and go, "Oh, that's a cool idea," but there's nothing you can sing along to, and it's not finished. And so Ted had done this a lot throughout his career. If you look at Ted's career, Ted was amazing at collaborative leadership, basically going, "Hey, I know what we can do. Let's call Skunk Baxter and have him play on the Carly Simon record." Or, "Hey, I got an idea. Let's call Tom Johnson and he can play rhythm guitar on Nicolette's record," or whatever. So Ted was really great about using his own artists to basically to work together, get his artists to work together.
Right.
And he did that a lot. Look, he did it at Nicolette. And I think part of that was that Ted was trying to always give his artists the opportunity. I mean, I know this, don't think he actually came out and said in the book, but I know this, to kind of, put their feet in the world of being a session musician, which is a totally different thing. Again, like you're guesting on someone's record, but also kind of Ted wanted to be like, okay, look, here's what you do. You come in and like kind of show them the ropes. Like, hey, maybe you be the guy 10 years from now. Maybe you're the guy who like people call. They're like, I need a guitar solo. I'm going to call X person to come in, Eddie Van Halen. Just make that up, So Ted was always about doing that, and so he brought Michael McDonald in. At his recollection was at Dave's request. Basically, Dave was stuck, and Dave knew that Ted had done this with Pest. Goes, maybe we get Mike to come in and work with me? And Ted said, yeah, I'm sure he could. So he called up Mike McDonald, Dewey Brothers, and who had written with like, I mean, like everybody on the planet, like he had worked with. Again, Carly Simon, of course, comes to mind.
Christopher Cross was a great
Christopher
one.
Cross,
Steely Dan.
Steely Dan.
Yeah, there's not a light rock song in the late '70s that you don't hear Michael McDonald doing background vocal song.
This was like he'd wake up out of a dead sleep and he'd be like, I need a hit, and he'd be like, oh, give me half a cup of coffee, and he's like, pour down, and he's like, writing, and like 5 minutes later it's a number one. So they brought him in, and he came into Warner Brothers. Dave, Ted, and Michael McDonald went to Ted's office at Warner Brothers, and there was a piano or keyboard in there, and they had the tape. They had a cassette of the song idea, Eddie's song idea. Eddie wasn't there, but they had the song idea. And from what I understand, Mike came up with the line, I'll wait, and definitely came up with the chorus melody. And there actually was a tape recording at one time, probably sitting on a shelf 5150, or maybe it's in the trash, who knows, but of Mike McDonald singing that. I go, oh, wait, maybe not with the exact same lyrics, but basically like that melody that we all know. Because if you listen to it, it's not our Dave melody. Like it's not a Dave. It's an unusual.
You're right.
It's a kind of an unusual melody. So, and the moral, I don't know what the moral of the story was.